in
This
U.S.
conference will now be recorded.
to improve understanding of ecosystem dynamics and applications of that understanding to the management of living marine resources. Since 1986, the seminar has provided an opportunity for research scientists and practitioners to meet, present, and provoke conversation on subjects pertaining to the physical and fisheries oceanography or regional issues in Alaska's marine ecosystems. Visit the EcoFoci webpage for more information at ecofoci.noaa.gov. We sincerely thank you for joining us today as we transition into a hybrid virtual and in-person fall series. Look for our speaker lineup via the One NOAA seminar series and on the NOAA PMEL calendar of events. If you miss a seminar, catch up on PMEL's YouTube page. It takes a few weeks to get these posted, but all seminars will be posted. I ask that you please make sure that your microphones are muted and that you are not using video. During the talks, please feel free to type your questions into the chat, and we will be monitoring the questions to address them at the end of the talks. Okay, first speaker is Silvana. Silvana is currently a postdoc at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Seattle. She earned her bachelor's degree in biological science from the University of the Republic of Uruguay and has a master's in oceanography from the University of Cádiz in Spain. She completed her PhD at the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences at the University of Washington in 2021. Thank you so much.
So what do I stand up here? It is up to you. I need to. Okay, here we go. Thank you everyone for joining. So I'll be presenting a synthesis of planktonic data that I've been working on in collaboration with all these authors here that actually know about plankton. And in particular, we are looking at the associations among different components of the plankton and the environment during this work period of 2017 through 2019 in the Northern Bering and Chukchi Sea. So we know that both the Northern Bering and Chukchi Seas have been undergoing increasing warming and sea ice loss in the last decades, and in particular during 2017 through 2019. So here there are some plots of water temperature. On top we have sea surface temperature for the Chukchi Sea, and we see high positive anomalies for this 2017 through 2019 period. And here on the bottom, we have sea surface temperatures for the Northern Bering Sea in the dashed line here. And in 2017, 2019, we see the highest surface temperatures on record for the Northern Bering Sea. Now looking at sea ice concentrations for the Chukchi Sea here on top, in gray, we have values for the 1978 through 2015 period, and the gray line here indicates the average for that historic period. And in orange, green, and red, we have sea ice concentrations for 2017 through 2019, and we can see how sea ice concentrations have been much lower than the mean average for the historic period, and in many cases for the extreme values from that period. And similar things we see for the Bering Sea. Here we have sea ice extent. The average for 1981 through 2010 in black here, and in yellow, I don't know if you can see well, and purple, we have the sea ice extents for 2017 to 2019, and they have been much lower and lowest than even the extrema for the period, the previous period. So all this warming and sea ice loss is expected to have really direct and rapid impacts on planktonic communities. We've seen changes in primary production, changes in the timing of the spring bloom and other biological processes, shifting the distribution of some species, and decreasing trends in the size of phytoplankton and zooplankton taxa and individuals. So just to show a few examples of these shifts in phytoplankton and zooplankton with warming, we have one example is from Lee and collaborators from the Canadian Arctic, showing how with increasing warming and freshening of seawater, we see that even though total chlorophyll hasn't changed much, we see decreasing trends in the amount of large phytoplankton cells and increasing trends in the concentrations of smaller phytoplankton cells. Now moving to zooplankton. This is work by Dave, looking at anomalies in the abundances of Calanus copepods. These are bigger and lipid-rich copepods, and here for small copepods for a series of warm and cold periods in the northern Bering Sea. And what we see is negative anomalies during warm periods for Calanus copepods and positive anomalies for cold periods. And kind of the opposite trend for small copepods with negative anomalies, so lower abundances than average in cold periods, and positive anomalies during the warm period, in particular in 2017 and 2019. And we're not only seeing these shifts in terms of the relative abundance of smaller versus larger copepods, but we're also seeing kind of decreases in the size of individuals within one species. And here we have, again, some example from Dave showing the mean length for many life stages of Calanus copepods for cold period and warm period, and we see how the mean sizes typically are lower and smaller for the warm period. So these changes in species composition and size structure of planktonic communities are expected to affect trophic interactions, energy pathways, benthic pelagic coupling, and have the potential to alter the entire structure of Arctic marine ecosystems and the services they provide to human communities. So to illustrate a little bit what we would expect for the energy flow under different conditions, here I have some very general conceptual models showing what we would expect to see under cold years, or also what we hypothesize to see in spring, when we have lower temperatures and higher availability of nutrients. These conditions are expected to favor large phytoplankton cells that can be directly consumed by large zooplankton and be readily available to upper trophic levels, whereas in warm years, what we expect to see with higher temperatures and in general lower availability of nutrients is more smaller phytoplankton cells that are typically consumed by microzooplankton. So we have microzooplankton as an intermediate here between phytoplankton and zooplankton, and then available to upper trophic levels. So during warm years, what we expect to see is more trophic links, a reduction in the trophic transfer efficiency, which results in less energy available for upper trophic levels and for the benths. So understanding these associations among planktonic communities and how do they respond to changes in the environment becomes critical to be able to understand more of the potential ecosystem-wide responses to climate change. So that's kind of the objective of the synthesis. So to look at these associations among different components of the plankton, I'm using data from the 4 Arctic IRP surveys, which included the 2 ASGAR surveys conducted in spring here in the northern Bering and southern Chukchi Sea in 2017 and 2018, and the 2 IES surveys conducted in late summer, early fall in 2017 and 2019 in the Chukchi Sea. And these surveys had a very comprehensive sampling of different components of the plankton and environmental variables. And for this work, I'm using just data on temperature, salinity, nutrients, total chlorophyll, and chlorophyll in 2 size fractions, less than 5 and greater than 5, representing phytoplankton salts of different sizes, the microzooplankton biomass, including dinoflagellates and ciliates, and abundances and biomass of small and large zooplankton taxa collected with these 2 mesh sizes respectively. So just first to start with the physical characteristics during these surveys. All of these surveys, again, were conducted during a period of extreme weather conditions, but we still observe some differences in terms of the oceanographic conditions. So here I dumped a lot of maps, but I'm going to highlight some of the main differences across surveys. So here on the left, we have water column temperature, salinity, and here surface nitrate concentrations integrated for the layer above the mixed layer depth. And here we have water masses, surface water masses, and bottom water masses on the right. So focusing first on the spring, we see how overall spring of 2017 was slightly warmer than 2018. In particular, mean bottom temperatures were like 1 degree Celsius higher compared to 2017. And if we look at bottom water masses here, we see how in 2018 we have a predominance of nutrient-rich anadir water here and cold shelf water here, whereas in 2017 we see a greater presence of warm shelf water in the bottom. And regarding nutrient concentrations, we see high nutrient concentrations throughout most of the region for both surveys, as we expect to have in the spring. Now, comparing the two summer surveys, summer of 29 was overall much warmer and fresher than 2017. Mean surface temperatures were over 2 degrees Celsius higher, and salinities were more than 1 unit of salinity lower compared to 2017. And here we see how in 2019 we have a predominance of warm coastal water throughout most of the Chukchi Shelf, whereas in 2017 the predominant water mass was warm shelf water. And in 2019, this warmer and fresher surface layer resulted in a shallower mixed layer depth and lower nutrient concentrations, again, compared to 2017. Now, looking at the phytoplankton and microzooplankton communities, here we have total chlorophyll, the proportion of chlorophyll in the small size fraction, and microzooplankton biomass combining both dinoflagellates and ciliates. What we see if we compare the season, as expected, spring had higher total chlorophyll, a greater predominance of large phytoplankton cells, and lower microzooplankton biomass compared to summer surveys. Now, if we just look at the two springs, we see how during the relatively colder spring of 2018, we see higher total chlorophyll and specifically a higher biomass of diatoms that year. Dinoflagellates, so in general, microzooplankton biomass didn't change between these two surveys, but we had shift in terms of which group was the predominant each year. Now, looking at summer, we see how total chlorophyll was very similar between the two summers, but we see a greater predominance of phytoplankton in the small size fraction. So smaller phytoplankton was predominant in summer, and that was observed particularly following the distribution of warm coastal water in 2019. And here I'm just bringing up some observations by Mike Lomas, where he saw really high contribution of these photosynthetic bacteria, Synechococcus, to the total phytoplankton biomass in 2019, also following the distribution of warm coastal water. So that predominance of small phytoplankton that we were seeing associated with warm coastal water is probably mainly a result of this Synechococcus species. And also in summer of 2019, what we see is a lower overall microzooplankton biomass. That is a result of really low biomasses of ciliates that year. So now moving to the mesozooplankton community, to look at the variability in the distribution of this zooplankton community across 4 surveys, what I used was a combination of cluster analysis with indicator species analysis. Basically, what we're doing is grouping the stations based on their similarity in the relative abundance of zooplankton taxa, and identifying which species or combination of species are more representative of each group. So what we got here are 4 different clusters, one cluster in gray here that is restricted to the spring and is characterized by these species of Copepod neocalanus that typically is present in spring and then disappears from the region. Then we have this other cluster here in orange that is restricted to the northern Chukchi Sea and characterized by the combined occurrence of Calanus glacialis and Calanus hyperboreus, these two big copepods, lipid-rich and very desirable prey for upper trophic levels. And then we have the distribution of these 2 other clusters in green and blue here, whose distribution shifted following the distribution of warm coastal water versus warm shelf water. So in 2019, when we had this predominance of warm coastal water over the Chukchi Shelf, we see an expansion both northward and offshore of this cluster here in blue that is characterized by the occurrence of these two copepod species that typically have an eritic distribution and now have a really wide distribution during this year. And then the distribution of this group in green here is very much restricted to the north compared to 2017, and is characterized by the occurrence of meroplanktonic taxa, in particular echinoderm larvae. So now to put all these pieces together and look at the correlative associations among these different groups and how those associations change between the two seasons and across the 4 surveys, I'm using structural equation models. These models can be visualized as these path diagrams, and I think they have like 2 advantages for this application. One is that each path here represents a hypothesized or a pre-assumed causal or directional relationship between the 2 variables, and also that each variable here can be both a predictor and a response variable. So we can test for indirect effects or cascading effects in our system. So once we define our paths, basically we translate this into a series of structural equations, which are basically just multiple linear regressions. And then we see if our data supports this hypothesized structure. So for this model, I started very complex, but ended up very simple for it to work. So at the end, I included biomass of large copepods and small copepods. Large copepods including Calanus, Neocalanus, and Eucalanus species, and small copepods including Pseudocalanus, Acartia, and Oetona species. Then I chose ciliates to represent the microzooplankton community because they track pretty well the total biomass of microzooplankton, and 2 size fractions of chlorophyll, less than 5 and greater than 5, and temperature as our environmental driver. So basically, I got one of these models for each of the first surveys, so we can compare across surveys and between the 2 seasons. So this is what we have here. So here are the path diagrams for the 2 spring surveys on the left, and for the 2 summer surveys on the right. And the black arrows here indicate significant paths, and the gray dash arrows here indicate paths that we tested for, but they didn't come as significant. And these coefficients here for the significant path represent kind of the strength of the effect of one variable on the other. So the greater the value, the stronger the effect. So we can compare within each year what variables had a stronger effect on the others. So coefficients for 2017 are shown in blue, for 2018 in green, and 2019 in red. So I just want to highlight a couple of things here from these models. So the first thing is that we see that the effects of temperature on large copepods is negative, strong and negative for surveys both in spring and summer. And then in the summer, we see that the effect of temperature on small copepods is positive. So that's suggesting that colder conditions tend to favor large copepods and warmer conditions favor small copepods, as we expect and we know from literature as well. And in particular, the effect of temperature on small copepods in 2019 was much stronger than 2017. That was when we had the really warm conditions and also freshening of seawater. And also that year, we saw much higher abundances of Pseudocalanus, this small copepod in the area. And the second thing I wanted to highlight from here is that in spring, we see a direct significant effect of chlorophyll on large copepods that is not present in the summer. Instead, in the summer, what we see is significant effects of ciliates on copepods. So in summer, so this might be indicating some sort of predation pressure of copepods on microzooplankton instead of directly on phytoplankton. And we know from work from Campbell and collaborators that zooplankton tend to prefer to eat microzooplankton in the summer. So this is kind of expected. And also, even though these are just correlative associations, we can kind of infer that in the summer we might be seeing a higher number of trophic levels than what we see in spring. So what? So we see that warming and the increasing inflow of warm coastal water into the Chakchi Sea that we observed in summer of 2019 was associated with smaller sized phytoplankton, in particular this kind of novel high contribution of Synechococcus to the total phytoplankton biomass in the region. A mesozooplankton community characterized by high biomass of small copepods, as we saw for Pseudocalanus in particular, and also the occurrence of these two species of copepods that are typically neritic and have different feeding strategies. They're basically carnivores. And we also saw lower microzooplankton biomass, and that can be due to a really high predation pressure, because these microzooplankton in summer of 2019 not only had kind of all the mesozooplankton that actually prefers to eat microzooplankton, but also these other two species that usually are not there in those abundances. So the other thing that we can get from these results is that this summer open water type of production that is characterized by smaller phytoplankton cells seems to be supporting a planktonic food web that has more trophic links that we see with a type of ice edge type of production as we see in spring with large phytoplankton. So the question now is, will summer conditions become kind of the norm for the Bering and Chakchi Seas over longer periods of the year in the absence of sea ice, or during a much earlier sea ice retreat? And I guess the answer is going to depend on many other factors, including what is going to happen with the mixing of the water column and therefore the availability of nutrients. But what we can guess is that this shift in terms of at least the size of copepods, so if we're replacing the repeat-leach large copepods by smaller, less nutritious copepods, we are reducing the food quality that is available to upper trophic levels. And also, if we have these higher number of trophic levels, we are reducing the energy that is available to those upper trophic levels. And also more energy or carbon is going to be retained in the pelagic, and less is going to be exported to the benthos. So overall, what we expect is this shift towards smaller planktonic organisms to have cascading effect throughout the food webs and have the potential to impact commercial and subsistent fish and shellfish resources, and obviously benthic ecosystems. So changing from the typical tight benthic pelagic coupling to a weaker benthic pelagic coupling in these systems. So that's all. Yay!
All right. Do we have any questions for Silvana while we get Ed set up?
I have one.
Yeah, Julie.
I got very curious right at the end about the neritic carnivorous copepods.
Yeah, I don't know much about them. I found like one paper, like those typewrite papers, and very obscure literature about those. So I don't know much about them. I just saw that at least one of the species, I don't remember, one is carnivores. So it's not even omnivore, it's just carnivore. So yeah.
Do you think they're being infected up, or is the food web more supportive of them also?
I think they were affected because they are associated with that warm coastal water that is probably coming from the Alaska coastal current, but I don't know.
They're definitely affected.
But the conditions, I guess, are also.
But yeah, once they're affected, the conditions are favorable for them.
Yeah.
Because the longipodata, for example, is a weird copepod. It's blue. It sits right in the surface. We don't see very much of it, and it exploded over the last periods of low ice. So why, we don't know. And they're big time in salmon diets when they explode. So.
Yeah, Lisa.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This is a little bit outside of your study, but with the warming, your metabolic rates will also increase, so they require more energy. Is there a way you could also put that into your modeling?
Not in this type of model, I
Okay.
think. Yeah, this is more just correlative associations, but in a different model for sure. Maybe Jens can do that in the inverse model.
We have a question in the chat from Lauren. What other structures of SEMS did you try? You said the one you presented was after some trial and error.
So I included other groups of copypods, like the neritic copypods that made it explicit in the mold. I also included nitrate. I included salinity first, but yeah, the mold wasn't really performing well. So I decided just to have the minimum things just to make some interpretations out of it. But at the beginning, I started with multiple environmental variables and more groups of copypods, and then the 2 groups of microsalt plankton. So I put everything that I had.
Yeah, Ed?
Yeah, my question is sort of related to Lisa's, I guess. Is it possible that any of the reduction in large zooplankton under warm conditions could be due to a top-down effect of increased grazing by fish as their metabolic demands are higher under warmer conditions?
Yeah, and for sure, and that applies even for chlorophyll as well. I don't know what is bottom-up driven versus top-down. So yeah, I'm not sure. If we had, yeah, we could add fish to the picture and see what the associations are with zooplankton here, but definitely that can be everything. Thanks.
Colleen said, the spring and fall study areas are somewhat different. How do you think that this affects your results?
Yeah, so that's the problem with this first survey, is that we don't know what is seasonal difference versus regional differences. Yeah, so that's going to be always kind of trying to use literature to distinguish between the 2 effects. But yeah.
Any other questions? Awesome. Well, I guess we can transition and get Ed set up. Thank you so much, Johanna. All right. Ed is a research assistant professor in atmospheric science at the University of Washington, and he studies high latitude climate and weather with a focus on sea ice variability and predictability. Welcome, Ed.
Thanks, and I'm hoping you can see my screen.
We can see a lot of stuff on your screen.
What can you see now?
I'm going to try that. Just your presentation.
Just the
That's
presentation?
perfect.
Yeah, that's perfect.
All right, great. And you can hear me all right?
I think we're on here.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to speak, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person. And today I want to talk about a recent study of a very recent case study that's been quite a fascinating case study. And my title is Record Low Sea Level Pressure Arctic Cyclone of January 22. How did it lead to record loss of sea ice, and how forecasts fared? And this figure here shows the synoptic situation on the 24th of January of 2022, so about a year and a half. And in black contours, you can see the sea level pressure. You might be able to read those labels. And in the background, I show you the sea ice concentration in the shading. So the blue areas were the sea ice, and blue is, sorry, the white areas where sea ice, and blue is where there's open ocean. And we're focusing on the sort of, I guess you could call it the European sector of the Arctic. So you can see Greenland on the left and Scandinavia to the bottom, and sort of western or northwestern Russia to the right. And you can clearly see a very strong cyclone. And let me hide this. Oh, no, sorry. I don't know how that happened. Can you hear me? Sorry, I don't know what. I was trying to hide the message on this software. So I'm hoping you can see this again. Are we back to the first slide?
Yeah, that looks great. Thanks.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry about that. So anyway, so if you This is, by the way, I'm going to be showing data from the ERA5 reanalysis for the atmosphere and the waves, and passive microwave for sea ice. And basically, the central pressure of the cyclone was 932 millibars. And anyone in the room that has experience, I'm a bit of a weather nerd, so anyone that has experience looking at weather maps will immediately notice or, kind of realize what a low value this is. And this is more typical of hurricanes or extremely low mid-latitude cyclones in the storm tracks, right? This is not typical in the Arctic. And I remember seeing this somewhat by chance on this day, on the 24th of January. I was looking at weather maps of the Arctic, and I remember quickly thinking, this is very atypical. So with my colleagues that we kind of by chance working on a project of Arctic cyclones and impact of waves on sea ice, we quickly started doing some research. And what I show you here is the time series of the lowest sea level pressure value every month between 1979 and 2022. So this is in the full ERA5 dataset in the satellite period. And on the left panel, that is the lowest sea level pressure value every month north of 70, so between 70 and 90 north. And on the panel on the right is north of 80 north. So, the very high Arctic. And what I show then is in the asterisks are the 10 previous record values, record low values of sea level pressure. And the dash values are the cyclone January 22 values. And you can see that it beat the record in both domains, like if we just look north of 70 or north of 80. But what's quite remarkable is how far north, not just how strong the cyclone was, but how far north it was. So if you look at the panel on the right, it beat the previous record by 5 millibars, and the second place, or the prior second place, by about 10 millibars. So, much, quite a bit bigger than the previous records. The other thing I wanted to note is that if you look at these time series, there's not an obvious trend to them. So we don't see a climate change signal in terms of the depth of the lowest cyclones. If we look at the tracks of the cyclone, this basically originated near Greenland, kind of went overhead from, about Svalbard, and sort of then went into the high Arctic, kind of through the Barents and the Kara, and that is shown in red for this cyclone. And then I'm showing in the other colors the previous 10 record cyclones that are all, the lowest values north of 70. These are all Atlantic cyclones, right? There's none of them coming in from the Bering. Of course, there's storms and strong cyclones coming in the Bering, but they don't have as low sea level pressure as the ones from the Atlantic. Now, taking a little bit closer look at the cyclone, it basically developed in two stages. And this panel on the top right, this shows you the central pressure of the cyclone. So the eye of the storm, like what the pressure was between the 21st of January and the 28th of January. And you can see that it kind of developed in two stages, right? There's an initial deepening of the sea level pressure from about 990 to 950 millibars on the 21st of January. And then it's kind of stable, and then there's a second deepening, a secondary low actually develops on the 23rd, and it's sort of kind of a little bit of a 1-2 punch. And so it's quite an interesting development or evolution. And these panels here, they show the sea level pressure contours in black, in magenta is the sea ice edge, and the shading, that kind of orange red shading, is the wind speed. And I show every 24 hours from the 20th of January in the top left, and time goes kind of to the right and down. And I do actually between the 23rd and the 24th of January, I show every 6 hours, and that's that very interesting period of the secondary development. So you can see that on the 21st and the 22nd, we see this kind of cyclone develops in the lee of Greenland, kind of just to the east of Greenland, and it actually tracks along the sea ice edge for a couple of days until the 23rd of January. And if you look at the top right panel, you can see just east of Iceland, this kind of this secondary low that starts developing in the warm sector. And if you look at the middle row, these are every 6 hours between the 23rd and the 24th of January. You see this kind of secondary development between Iceland and Norway just deepens extremely quickly and sort of then swings north towards Svalbard. and on the 24th of January at 12 UTC, it's just to the east of Svalbard, and you can see all those really tightly packed contours, so very, very high wind speeds. And then, over the following few days, it started weakening and slowly, traveling into the Arctic, and kind of pretty much lose it by the 28th or the 29th of January. Now, if we look at the winds and the ocean waves, it was extremely windy, as you might expect from those very tightly packed sea level pressure contours. And the highest value was 100 km/h winds, and these are the sustained 1-hour winds, so the gusts would have been even higher. And again, that would be a hurricane, Cat 1 hurricane. So we have basically hurricane level winds in the Arctic with this cyclone. In the shading, that is the significant wave height. And you can see there's, massive waves, as you might expect from the winds. The blue arrows, that is the direction of waves, of ocean waves. And you can see we had wave heights of over 6, even 8 meters in the open ocean. And especially in the Barents, these waves were mostly traveling towards the ice pack, right? Or into the ice pack, as you can, the magenta, there's the ice edge, right? So, we expect that had a big impact on the sea ice. The other thing we did is there's a new relatively new NASA satellite, ICESat-2, which is basically a very high precision laser altimeter. And myself and some colleagues have shown how you can use this to measure waves in the ice. And what I show you here is a transect from the satellite on January the 23rd. It is a day before the peak of the cyclone, but there was still very high winds and waves already on the 23rd. And that bottom right panel shows you the surface height along that transect. And as you go from left to right in that figure, and that bottom right figure is from south to north. And basically we can detect pretty impressive waves in the sea ice, like over 2 meters in height at the southern kind of sea ice area, closer to the sea ice edge, which is where you expect the bigger waves. And you can see how they dampen as you go along the transect, but they still penetrate the sea ice quite a long way. And why is this maybe important? This is a little, just to give you a sense of what waves in sea ice can be like. This is a little video I took myself in the Beaufort Sea from an icebreaker, and hopefully you can see, this is pretty much close to 100% or at least 95% sea ice concentration, right? But the waves are still getting into the sea ice, and you can see this kind of swell. And the other thing to notice is how small the flow size distribution is, right? That ice is really broken up, and that's what waves can do to the sea ice. Okay, in terms of the temperatures, quite often these cyclones in the winter bring pretty warm temperatures and sort of heat and moisture fluxes into the Arctic. This figure, I show you the daily map of temperature anomalies here. And there were some pretty big anomalies, up to 10, 15 degrees Celsius. You can see all that red shading, especially on the 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th of January. And it's normally to the east and north of the cyclone center. So this is where the warm sector kind of wraps around the cyclone, bringing warm air from the south. So it was a warm episode. But if we look at the temperature distributions, these were not record warmth, right? So it was a record strong cyclone in terms of the depth and the wind speeds, but not in terms of temperatures, right? So it was warm, but not record warm. And this is relevant when we see the impact on the sea ice of the cyclone. These distributions on the right, they show the average temperature over the Barents domain and the Barents-Kara-Laptev domain. And the blue histogram is the historical temperatures for January between 79 and 2021, and the black lines, that's the maximum of this storm. So you can see it's to the right of the distributions. So it's anomalously warm, but it's not. They weren't record warm. They're actually quite a few degrees, 3-4 degrees from the records for this time of the year. Okay, so now moving on to the impact on the sea ice of the storm. Here is, I show you the sea ice concentration on January the 21st and January the 27th, so before and after the cyclone, in the panels on the left, and then the panel on the right shows the difference between the two dates. And I mean, you can just visually pick up just looking at the 2 panels on the left, but when you look at the difference, it very clearly shows like there was a massive decline in sea ice concentration, and there were two main areas. One is the main sea ice edge along the Barents and the Kara, and that basically, that retreated kind of into the Arctic. And then there's the second area of sea ice or open ocean that opened between northern Svalbard and northern Franz Josef, and yeah, this is quite atypical for the sea ice this far north to basically retreat and open up in January. And this is climatologically, this is still a time of sea ice growth and expansion. Now, if you integrate the sea ice concentration in this dashed box on the right, this is the Barents Kara West Laptev. We see that this was a record loss of weekly sea ice area over a 6-day period, and that is shown by this histogram in the middle and the bottom. This histogram, that is all 6-day changes in sea ice area for that region from 79 to 2020. The black line is the observed value with this cyclone, and it was we lost almost 500,000 square kilometers in this region over just 6 days, and this was 30% greater than the previous record. And if you look at the time series on the left, I show this 2022 is shown in black, and all the other years 79 to 2020 are shown in the kind of orange to blue faded time series, and with the mean in magenta. And you can see that this cyclone actually meant that we went from slightly positive sea ice extent anomalies, sea ice area anomalies in this region, to the 6th lowest on record for that date. And generally sea ice concentration is a lot more has a lot more persistence than, say, temperature or atmospheric variables, right? So for such a big change over such a small time period is very, very unusual. How did the forecast do? So this is segueing now into how the forecast performed. These are forecasts from the ECMWF of sea level pressure in the black contours and the winds in the shading. And I show lead times from 8 days to 0 days. So the top left panel, that's the 192-hour forecast, which is 8 days. And as you go along each panel, you kind of get a day shorter to the 24th of January, which is the target forecast. And that is shown on the figure on the right. And if you're looking at this figure, especially from the back of the room, and the middle and bottom rows, if they all look the same to you and they look very similar to the target figure or the target panel on the right, that is a sign that these were very skilled forecasts of the cyclone. And that's what we found. The ECMWF model did a really good job at forecasting this cyclone up to 5 days in advance. But even if you look at the top panel, the top row, those 8, 7, and 6 day forecasts, it was still forecasting a really big storm somewhere in the vicinity, right? It wasn't quite as strong, and you can see how the forecast from one day to the next kind of, it's bouncing around a little bit, but then from 5 days onwards, it gets it, it's a very good forecast for such an extreme and unusual event. And this is confirmed by looking at metrics like the central pressure error. So that is the error in the forecast of the cyclone's lowest pressure in the middle, or looking at the position error of the cyclone, which is shown by the kind of more orangey time series. And these metrics are very high skill, especially from 120 hours onwards, especially when we compare it with past cyclones or the skill of other cyclones in the past. And finally, how did the forecast of sea ice did? Well, this is that same model, the ECMWF forecast model, also has a sea ice component. So it can also forecast sea ice variables like sea ice concentration and thickness. And these are the same figures I showed you earlier, but for the forecast, right? So on the top left is the sea ice concentration in the forecast when it's initialized on the 21st of January. And then the middle panel is the forecast, the 6-day forecast of sea ice concentration on the 27th of January. And then the panel on the right is the difference in the forecast. And just to remind you what the observed difference was, if you compare those two panels, you can see that the forecasts got a lot less of the observed sea ice loss. And that's quite interesting because the atmospheric forecast was very good, but the sea ice just didn't respond enough in the forecast model. And if you look at the total sea ice area for that region in the forecast, that is shown in the colored lines, that kind of orange, so the red to blue faded lines, that is for every initialization from the January, from different forecasts in January. And you can, and the observations are in black, and you can see that yes, they do forecast a lot in sea ice, but it's about half to a third of what we observed. Now we see something similar in thickness, and I think I might skip this for time, but very quickly I mentioned that we saw quite a loss of sea ice thickness in observations, but the forecasts didn't really. They underpredicted how much sea ice thickness was lost with the cyclone. Now this is kind of a little schematic slide. It's my final slide about how waves and sea ice, how we think in reality they have an impact, and how they are for now simulated in forecast models. So on the left, we see that in reality we know that waves coming from the ocean, and they do penetrate into the sea ice. They do dampen and become smaller as they go into the sea ice, but they do actually, they can travel quite a bit into the sea ice pack, and we know that they break the sea ice, so the flow size distribution becomes a lot smaller. And we also know that these waves, they can help mix the upper ocean, right? So you get turbulent mixing, so you can bring up warm waters from below in observations. And one of our hypotheses when we saw that huge loss of sea ice in the observations with a cyclone that wasn't that warm, because we looked at the surface fluxes and the atmosphere itself cannot account for that much sea ice loss, we hypothesized that basically this is a lot of melting from below, right? That the ocean with those very strong winds and waves is getting mixed, and you're getting melting from below of that sea ice. Whereas in the model, we are, as of today, these forecast models and even GCMs, they don't simulate waves going into the sea ice, right? They can simulate waves in the ocean, but once they get to the sea ice, it's like a wall, and it's like they reach land, they just die, and the sea ice is not at all affected by the waves in the model, and therefore you wouldn't be able to get this kind of ocean turbulent mixing process, and you probably wouldn't, and so you wouldn't be able to get the enhanced melting from below, which is why we think that in the forecast, the atmosphere, even if you could forecast the atmosphere really well, you're not getting that sea ice response. And I will just leave some of the kind of summary highlights here. And if you're interested in the study, we published this in JGR Atmospheres last year, or you can send me an email or come and see me in Atmospheric Sciences on campus. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. Do we have any questions for Ed? That was a great talk.
Sure, I'll ask a question. So Ed, in the model comparison that you were pointing out that didn't capture the sea ice loss, I also noticed in that that it enhanced sea ice creation off the coast of Greenland. That was not in reality. You hypothesize that it's the same mechanism happening here, that the turbulent mixing or whatnot is also not being accounted for on the cold sector side of the storm?
That's a really good question. And yes, I mean, you could have the same mechanism, even though on that side of the storm, you have more the offshore winds, right, or off ice winds rather than on ice winds. You're still going to have, you're probably still going to have enhanced turbulent mixing under the sea ice, even just from enhanced sea ice motion. You're probably still going to have some, some waves, maybe small on that side, but yeah, that's quite likely, also having an impact on that side of the cyclone. In observations in the East Greenland, yeah, we saw very little change in the sea ice concentration, even if you're blowing these really strong, fairly cold winds on that side of the cyclone, kind of off ice. yeah, no, that's a good question. It's we focus more a little bit on the sea ice loss side of the problem, but yeah, I mean it's these mechanisms. If there's a bias in the model and the mechanisms, it's going to be everywhere.
What do you think it'll take to incorporate waves and sea ice into forecast models?
It's another very good question, and there's quite a few different research groups working on this, including my colleague Cecilia Bitz, and we are getting quite close. And my goal, or one of our goals in this project, is to run not with the ECMWF forecast model, because that's not something we can run, because you have to be at ECMWF to run that model pretty much. But we've been using the NCAR GCM, the CSM model that some of you might be familiar with. And what we've been doing is that we've been using, and it's a fully coupled model, and CC Bits is working on incorporating a wave sea ice coupling module to that model. And what we would love to do is to our aim is to run the model with the observed atmosphere, right? So basically you replicate the observed cyclone in the GCM. You can do this with a nudging component, and to basically switch on and off the wave sea ice coupling, right? So you run a simulation where you have the observed cyclone, but the default model, so no wave sea ice coupling. And then you repeat the experiment, but you allow, or you have the wave sea ice coupling active. And we're very curious to see if how big of a difference that might make. And in this model, a nice thing about working with a GCM is that you pretty much have all the data output you want, and so you can look at the ocean response. One of the issues with the observations is that, although this is also something I'm working on with a colleague, we did find an Argo float from the Barents for that week, and it does show a huge response of the ocean all the way down to the bottom 200 meters depth in terms of velocity and temperature difference before and after the cyclone. So we're starting to see some evidence that yes, like the ocean responded quite strongly to the cyclone, and that it probably fluxed a lot of heat to the sea ice.
Any other questions in the room or in the chat?
Looks like lots of compliments, great talks, lots of thank yous.
All right, thank you so much. Let's thank both of our speakers.
Yes,
for your time.
thank you.